Welcome to Impact the World, a podcast from West Park Baptist Church in Knoxville, Tennessee. This is where we discuss topics related to how we can all love God, love people, and impact the world. Here's your host, Tara Hayes.
I am your host, Tara Hayes, and I'm happy to have you with us today. I am getting to sit down with one of our global partners today that we've heard from before, Carmen. Hello, Carmen.
Hi, how are you?
Good. The reason I get to have her again, which is always exciting, is because she has brought a friend with her who is a national partner from Cuba, Rhode. Hello, Rhode.
Hola.
Oh, yeah. So the fun thing about this episode is that everything that Rhode says will be in Spanish, and Carmen will be interpreting for us. But I think that's really exciting because we get to hear in her own voice what God is doing, where she is, and how she is getting to serve in her country. So Carmen, or actually Rhode, how did you and Carmen become colleagues?
¿Cómo es que nosotros llegamos a trabajar juntas?
Bueno, conocimos a Carmen mientras ella viajaba a Cuba con grupos misioneros. Yo estaba dirigiendo el Ministerio Infantil de la Convención Bautista de Cuba Oriental y Carmen llegó a mi oficina con títeres.
So I actually met Carmen when we were working together with different mission groups that were coming into the country. Carmen came to my office at the Eastern Baptist Convention of Cuba with a trunk of puppets.
Luego, unos años después, en ese momento ella era muy joven, unos años después ella regresó a trabajar con las 99 Aventuras, nos contactamos y ahí comenzamos una nueva etapa de trabajo que nos ha llevado hasta hoy.
And so that's been a while back. She was younger back then. That was 2007.
We all were.
And then that was back in 2007. And so fast forward to 2018, we were able to meet one another again. And that was through our connection with 99 Adventures. And since that time in 2018, we've been working together.
That's exciting. So tell me, Carmen and Rhode, about 99 Adventures, because that's really what you work on a lot together.
Háblame un poco de las 99 Aventuras porque veo que ustedes están trabajando mucho en este área.
Sí, dentro de todas las áreas ministeriales que desarrollamos en Cuba, uno de los fuertes de trabajo es los programas bíblicos que podemos ofrecer a las iglesias. Dentro de ellos está 99 Aventuras.
So she has several areas of ministry work with her team. And one of those ministry areas is like Bible teaching and training. And one of the programs that's offered under the Bible teaching, training, Christian Ed for local churches is 99 Adventures.
En Cuba tenemos una característica y es que después que los profesores oficiales de 99 Aventuras, Jean, su equipo, Carmen entre ellos, fueron a Cuba y dieron 2 entrenamientos en el 2019. Desde el 2019 hasta acá, nosotros hemos reproducido el entrenamiento 8, 9 veces.
So since the first training that came to Cuba back in 2019, that was with Jim Cook and a group of us who came down to train, we gave 2 trainings. But since that time, Rhode has brought together a team. They have reproduced the training throughout Cuba, and they've been able to do 8 or 9 trainings since the time that we gave the first training in 2019.
Para este año nos trazamos la meta de alcanzar 500 iglesias con 99 Aventuras. Y estamos cerca de alcanzar la meta, pero hay más solicitudes.
For 2023, we took on the challenge, and our goal has been to be able to train 500 churches with the material.
Wow.
We're almost there. We've just passed the 400 mark, and
Wow.
we are hoping to hit 500 by the end of this year. And then that gives each of those churches 2 years of like Sunday school material. And then we have more churches asking for training for 2024.
Wow. So how many churches total? I mean, I think, and we'll back up and talk a little bit about ministry and what the church looks like in Cuba, because
Right.
I think a lot of us in the States don't understand what that really looks like. So I think when you say 500 churches, I think that'll be a real surprise to people. So how many churches do you think you would maybe reach out to in 2024?
En 2024, entonces, digamos, ¿cuántas iglesias están pensando en entrenar?
Estamos trabajando para la misma cantidad, 500 iglesias. No es que esas sean las únicas iglesias que se pueden alcanzar, pero tenemos que hacer una meta alcanzable.
So we'll probably go ahead and continue with the 500 goal. That doesn't mean those are the only churches that are asking for training or want training, but we have to have a reachable goal for my team.
Yeah. Well, and I think, and probably need to back up a little bit and help people understand what Rhode has done in Cuba for so many years. So, Rhode, can you tell us about, explain to us how you came to salvation, to know about Jesus Christ, and then what you've done, as an adult. I mean, you have a long history of ministry in Cuba.
Perdón que no he hablado de tu tiempo de salvación y todo lo que has hecho con el ministerio antes. ¿Me puedes hablar un poco de tu experiencia de salvación?
Sí, eso es un punto de partida muy importante en el resto de mi vida.
That is a very important point in my life, my salvation experience that has guided the rest of my life.
Pero tengo que ir un poquito atrás y pensar en el hogar donde nací.
But I actually have to go a little further back and tell you about the home that I was born into.
Okay.
Ambos mis padres se conocieron en la iglesia y así que yo nací en un hogar creyente.
My parents met in our church, and so I was born into a Christian family.
Wow.
Pero no solo ellos eran creyentes en Cristo, miembros de la iglesia, eran líderes fieles al servicio del Señor en la comunidad.
But my parents were not just church members. My parents were Christian leaders within their church. They were faithful and strong Christian leaders within their church and their community.
Cada uno vino a esta relación con sus fortalezas y yo creo que de ambos tengo yo el fuerte, de mi papá la pasión por estudiar, de mi mamá su entrenamiento para el trabajo dentro de la iglesia.
And I would say what they brought with them to the church as Christian leaders were their strengths. And they had different strengths, but I believe that I've pulled from both of those strengths. My dad was passionate about learning and studying. I believe I got that from him. And my mom was formed well in the area of Christian education, and I believe that I've been able to take that part from her life.
Y para ellos no fue fácil por las condiciones en que crecieron, pero llegaron a ser importantes dentro de la comunidad cristiana. Y así crecí yo.
And so it wasn't very easy for them to get where they got as leaders within the Christian church during that time period. But that's where they were able to get to. They became very important Christian leaders in the community, and that's the home that I was born into.
Pero estando en un campamento de niños cuando tenía no había llegado a los 8 años, cuando la misionera estaba hablando, hizo el desafío para los niños cristianos, yo pensé, yo no soy cristiana.
And I was at a children's camp before I had actually hit 8 years old of age. So I was like right between 7 and 8 when I went to this children's camp. And there was a missionary who was doing the devotional time. And she began to talk to us and call us Christian children. And I thought, I'm not a Christian.
Tenía muy claro que mis padres eran cristianos, que yo había sido educada en los conceptos acerca de Dios, pero yo nunca había reconocido a Jesús como mi Salvador.
I was very clear that my parents were Christians. I grew up in a Christian home. I knew about the things of God, but I had never made a personal decision for myself that I needed Jesus as my Lord and Savior. I had never recognized the sinfulness that was in me as an individual.
Ese mismo día lo hice y al año siguiente, en el mismo lugar, yo decidí servir a Dios por tiempo completo.
And so I accepted Christ there at that camp just before hitting 8 years old. And a year later, I was back in that camp right before I turned 9 years old. And that is when I surrendered my life to full-time Christian ministry.
Wow.
Pero pasaron algunas cosas importantes. Una, mi papá, aunque era diácono de la iglesia, no entendía que un niño podía entender el evangelio y hacer una decisión.
But a couple of really important things happened after that period of time. Number one, my dad was a deacon and a lay pastor in our church, but he did not have an understanding that children could accept Christ as their Lord and Savior and understand the gospel.
Wow.
Dios puso a mi pastor en esa trayectoria, en ese camino, y mi pastor me ayudó a esperar el tiempo que mi papá aceptó para que yo fuera bautizada, y eso fue alrededor de los 12 años.
Luckily, the Lord gave me a pastor at our church who walked with me through this period of time. He understood my dad's point, and he knew that I had accepted Christ, and he helped me to be patient and wait until I was 12 years old, which is when my dad felt comfortable with me getting baptized.
Pero esto fue interesante porque la segunda cosa es que en ese tiempo en mi país la mayoría de los líderes no aceptaban que los niños pudieran entender el evangelio.
But that was a really interesting time in our country, I would say. Most of the Christian leaders during that time did not believe that children could understand the gospel and make a decision.
That is very interesting.
Qué interesante.
Fue hasta el año 92 y ya yo en el servicio a tiempo completo en la obra del Señor, que entró una organización a Cuba que comenzó a hablar de la salvación de los niños.
It wasn't until 1992, I was already in full-time Christian ministry, when a ministry from outside of Cuba came in and they were able to explain why children can understand the gospel.
Wow.
Y nos cambió completamente la perspectiva.
And that changed all of us as leaders. It changed our perspective on evangelizing children.
Entonces yo entré a ese ministerio casi en sus inicios.
And so I became a part of this ministry really from its beginnings, the ministry that came into Cuba.
Así que desde el año 94 yo soy misionera de la Alianza Pro Evangelización del Niño.
So since 1994, I have been a missionary for Child Evangelism Fellowship.
Oh, okay.
Y he atravesado todos los filtros que la alianza requiere para los misioneros. Pero esa no era solo el área en que yo me desarrollaba.
And so I've been a part of all of their trainings, everything that you have had to have in order to be a missionary with Child Evangelism Fellowship.
También trabajé mucho tiempo con las mujeres de mi país.
But outside of children's ministry, I also spent a lot of my ministerial life working with women's ministry in my country.
Y es algo que me encanta.
And that is an area of ministry that I love.
Oh.
Pero Dios ha sido claro en mostrarme un camino específico y es mirar a la niñez y las necesidades con que crecen en mi país.
But God has been very clear in directing me towards children's ministry to be able to see the children in my country and the needs that exist there.
I can see why that would be so important, hearing your story and now understanding that coming from years of children not really being evangelized or taken seriously, that I understand now why that is such a big part of your ministry.
Yo puedo entender esta carga que tienes en cuanto al ministerio infantil después de que hayas aceptado a Cristo de una edad tierna durante un tiempo donde no pensaban que los niños podían entender el evangelio.
Por eso se ha convertido en un desafío, que los padres puedan entender que necesitan llevar a sus hijos a Cristo, que los maestros puedan entender que la iglesia puede ayudar a las familias. Y no estoy pensando en su necesidad física, sino en la necesidad que tienen los niños de Dios.
And so that has been like a challenge for our ministry. We've been able to see the need for the parents to be able to bring their children to church, to hear the gospel, the church to be able to recognize the need that children have for Jesus as their Savior and be able to equip families to lead them in their Christian life. And so we're not just seeing the physical needs that the children in the country have, but also their spiritual needs.
So sometimes in the United States, once children reach kind of adulthood, college age, it becomes a little harder to reach them. Do you see that trend in Cuba as well?
Aquí en los estados decimos que ya cuando un muchacho ha llegado a la edad de universidad es mucho más difícil alcanzarlos para Cristo. ¿Tú ves esta tendencia en Cuba también?
También.
Yes.
Y es la experiencia de los grandes líderes que han hecho estudios. Y yo me dedico a anotar los líderes que se han convertido a la edad de niños. Porque aun cuando pasen por procesos difíciles, la semilla del evangelio está en ellos. Y en algún momento puede dar fruto.
So I look back at the great Christian leaders over time, and I've made notes of those who accepted Christ when they were children. Maybe they go through difficult times in their youth or as they get older, but they always come back when that seed has been planted in them from a young age.
And that's biblical.
Yeah,
You
yes,
see that
es
in
bíblico.
biblical. Yeah. Wow. So that's really, your ministry is very exciting to me. And the things that you're getting, you have the opportunity to be a part of. But I know even now, it's beginning to reach even beyond Cuba.
Yeah, yo siento que tu ministerio es un ministerio muy emocionado. Me emociona a mí, pues, pero yo veo que aún tu ministerio tiene un alcance que está fuera de Cuba.
Alcanzando Generaciones, que es el nombre del ministerio, trata de compartir la visión de que los niños pueden ser alcanzados, discipulados y conectados con una congregación.
So to give you an idea, I've started a ministry that's called Reaching Generations. And so with Reaching Generations, the concept is that we are able to evangelize the children where they are, disciple them, and then we can connect them to the local church in Cuba.
Y nuestro centro está en capacitar a las personas para que puedan tener esa visión.
And so our center, our focus is to be able to train people so that they can grab that vision that we have.
Dios nos ha permitido encontrar alianzas con hermanos fuera del país. Algunos están participando en nuestros entrenamientos, otros están cooperando para el desarrollo del ministerio y muchos están orando por lo que está sucediendo en Cuba y en la niñez de manera general.
But through this ministry, I've been able to make connections outside of Cuba where we have people who understand the vision, they've grasped it themselves, and they want to be a part of it, whether that's through praying, through giving, through coming and serving alongside of us. They see the need with the Cuban children.
Yeah. Well, that's exciting. And I know that's partially why you're here, is to meet partners in the United States.
Y yo sé que ese es parte propósito de tu viaje a Tennessee, por ejemplo, conocer a otros en los estados que han sido partners contigo.
Estamos también muy emocionados por eso. Por casi 5 años, una iglesia en Tennessee respaldó los campamentos de niños, respaldó los proyectos misioneros. Los niños en Cuba llegaron a tener una ofrenda que ellos mismos recogían para sostener a un misionero cubano.
Yes, that's part of the purpose of my trip. And we had a church in Tennessee, in Nashville. They partnered with us for 5 years, and they came down and they were able to help us to have children's camps. They actually helped us have mission camps for children. And so we had children in Cuba who were taking up missions offerings. Children in Cuba.
Oh, that makes my heart so happy.
Yeah. Me hace sentir el corazón todo contento.
Well, that's a good segue into just everyday life, what ministry looks like in Cuba.
Okay.
Because, in the United States, I think we all realize we have it fairly easy. Mm-hmm. I mean, ministry is work, but we don't have some of the barriers and some of the things that could hold us back. So I'd like to talk about what ministry looks like in Cuba.
Me gustaría hablar un poco acerca de cómo se ve el ministerio en Cuba, porque nosotros, bueno, tenemos que reconocer que aquí en los Estados Unidos, sí, el ministerio es trabajo, pero tenemos todo a nuestro alcance. Entonces, me encantaría escuchar un poco de cómo es la vida a diario en cuanto al ministerio que ustedes hacen en Cuba.
Sí, por ejemplo, el 60% de los niños que alcanzamos con el ministerio o que alcanza cualquier otro ministerio de niños o cualquier iglesia no provienen de padres creyentes ni de hogares que pertenecen a una comunidad cristiana.
So, to give you an idea, the 60% of the children that our ministry is reaching, and that really any ministry is reaching in Cuba, they do not come from Christian homes. They do not come from church homes. Their parents are not connected to a local church.
Así que los ministerios de niños en Cuba tienen que tener claro un enfoque hacia afuera.
And so the churches and ministries in Cuba have to have a very clear understanding that ministry is outside of the church.
Ahora, no tenemos ni siquiera los recursos para los ministerios internos, para los ministerios de la iglesia. Probablemente no tengamos un material para las escuelas bíblicas dominicales, no tenemos los materiales para campamento, ni los recursos para traer a los niños a campamento, ni las familias tienen los recursos para enviar a sus hijos a este tipo de actividades.
To give you an idea, within the church in Cuba, we don't have the resources even for the children's ministry that's happening inside of the church. So we definitely don't have the resources we need for what's going on outside of the church. So inside of the church, we don't have the resources for Sunday school material. We don't have the resources to send children to a Christian camp. Their parents don't have those resources either.
Otra de nuestras barreras es que no tenemos edificios para el trabajo con niños, no tenemos aulas donde decir esto es solamente para los niños, con los recursos que llevan los niños. Entonces, adaptar nuestros locales, tal vez a un patio, un árbol, una cocina o una casa para el trabajo con los niños.
And these resources that we're missing are even with regards to the structural part of the church. Churches don't have like a separate area for children's ministry, a classroom for children's ministry. So we're having to think even out of the box as it pertains to physical structure. So if we want to do children's ministry, it may be out in a yard, it may be under a tree. We don't have the resources that we need in the church for the children's ministries.
So even, a lot of people would say, well, there's digital resources, but things like that are not even really an option, are not an easy to come by option in Cuba.
Digamos que la gente puede pensar, bueno, pero hay opciones digitales, pero aún cosas así, aunque pueden estar al alcance de alguien, no, en Cuba no se puede bajar fácilmente un currículo digital, digamos.
Sí, la cuestión de lo digital la estamos usando, pero no es para un % grande de personas.
Yeah, I would say like digital resources, yes, of course, they're available. To download them in Cuba, not very probable. And so I would say that the majority of people who are able to have access to digital resources is a very small percentage of people.
La mayoría de las personas no tienen computadoras, no tienen teléfonos. Entonces, no tienen cómo manejar esos recursos, no tienen acceso al internet.
So the problem is that you may be given a digital resource, but many people in Cuba don't have access to a computer. They don't have access to a smartphone to be able to download that material. And many times we don't have access to internet.
Right.
Entonces, cuando ofrecemos un taller o algunos recursos que son vía digital, tenemos que tener una memoria flash para poderla repartir y eso es muy costoso, pero luego las personas llegan con eso y no tienen los equipos tampoco para poderlo usar.
So sometimes if there's like a workshop or something that we want to do online, maybe they don't have access to be able to download that onto a smartphone or a computer. So we have to find flash drives, which are very hard to come by and very expensive in Cuba. So we find a flash drive, we put everything on it for them, we give them the flash drive. But if you don't have a computer to connect
Then you
the
can't do
flash drive
anything with
to,
it.
you have a flash drive with
Yeah.
information on it, but you can't access the information.
So ideally, printed materials are your number one need.
Entonces, ideal sería tener los materiales impresos.
Ujú. Esa es la forma en que más iglesias lo pueden alcanzar.
Yes, more churches are able to have access to the material if it is printed.
Pero
But
no se puede entrar materiales impresos a Cuba,
you can't bring printed materials into Cuba
a menos que haya un permiso.
unless you get a certain permission and authorization to do so.
Y no se pueden imprimir en Cuba por el costo de los recursos.
And you also can't print in Cuba because of the cost of the resources. So, like,
That makes it very tricky.
because to print, you have to have electricity for a printer. You have
Right.
to have paper to print on. You have to have ink to print.
That's
A pesar de todo eso, en momentos específicos Dios nos da salidas y las aprovechamos.
But we'll say, despite all of that, there have been times where the Lord has opened doors for us, and we just have to walk through them when those doors open.
No siempre tenemos todas las cosas que necesitamos,
We don't always have everything we need,
pero siempre tratamos de estar listos o preparados para cuando tengamos los recursos poderlos utilizar.
but we always try to be ready so that if an opportunity comes about, if a door opens, that we can act on that.
Y nuestro trabajo no depende de los recursos que tenemos.
And fortunately, our ministry work doesn't depend on the resources that we have at hand in the moment.
Los recursos nos ayudan a hacer más.
The resources help us to do ministry better or more ministry.
Pero si no, uno de nuestros lemas es lo que te viniera a la mano para hacer, hazlo, según tu fuerza.
But one of our slogans is whatever comes to your hands to do ministry wise, do it.
wow. I think I love to see how the Lord uses. It's just a good reminder that you don't always have to have excess of resources to do ministry. And the gospel will always go forth no matter what we have because it's coming from Him.
Yeah, es un buen recordatorio que no necesitamos siempre acceso a recursos para hacer ministerio. Es bueno tenerlos, pero no tenemos que hacerlo y el evangelio, sea lo que sea, como viene de Él y no algo que nosotros podemos añadir, va a seguir adelante el evangelio.
Hace años atrás, 2 décadas, no, hace años atrás, el Señor puso en mi corazón preparar un programa de capacitación para que las iglesias tuvieran acceso a líderes capaces, preparados para dirigir el ministerio.
Years ago, the Lord put on my heart that I was to train leaders so that you would have leaders who are trained and ready to do ministry well.
Así que creamos un programa para una cátedra del Seminario Bautista de Cuba Oriental que gradúa ministros de niños.
So I was, as part of her master's work, she was able to put together a children's ministry track for those who had the desire to study children's ministry formally within the seminary, the Baptist Seminary of Cuba.
Entonces, eventualmente, las iglesias tienen la oportunidad de que la persona que esté dirigiendo su ministerio de niño tenga una capacitación que le da visión, le da profundidad bíblica o teológica y le da métodos.
And so what the local church has in Cuba that they can do, they can send someone to get trained to be a children's ministry leader who will have all of the training that they need. They have the biblical and the theological knowledge that they need, and they have the knowledge resource of being able to lead a children's ministry for the local church.
Esas personas van a sus iglesias y en sus iglesias forman su equipo de trabajo ministerial con el Ministerio de Niños.
After they've gone through seminary, they've graduated as a children's minister, they go into their churches and they develop a team to work under them in the area of children's ministry.
Y entonces utilizan lo que tienen, han tenido la capacitación para poder adaptar lo que tienen.
So
en su
they
área.
use what is at their reach, right? So they have been trained, and the training has taught them that they have to adapt in whatever environment to the resources they have.
Hemos tenido hermanos muy capaces de los Estados Unidos, de Canadá, de otros países también que han ido a cooperar y han sido parte de esos procesos de formación.
And so we've had seminary professors come in from the United States, from Canada. They have come and they've given up their time to pour into this children's ministry training as we've been forming children's ministers for the island. And so they have been trained well.
Wow. That is exciting.
Yeah, qué emocionante.
Let's talk about the seminary, because I think in a lot of our thinking, I think people would be surprised to find out there's a Baptist seminary in Cuba.
Yeah.
And there is a thriving church in Cuba. And so let's talk a little bit about the seminary and what does that look like? Because is there opposition? I guess is maybe the best way to put that.
Yeah, it actually looks very similar to the seminary in the United States, which is really interesting. Entonces hablamos un poco acerca del seminario, porque me imagino que mucha gente que están escuchando este podcast está diciendo, wow, hay un seminario bautista en Cuba. Entonces, hablamos un poco del seminario porque lo que nosotros sabemos de Cuba es que hay una iglesia que está creciendo, hay una iglesia viva en Cuba, pero ¿hay oposición en cuanto al seminario? ¿Cómo se ve el seminario en Cuba?
Hay oposición, hay muchas restricciones económicas para el desarrollo de los estudiantes, para que los estudiantes puedan estar, pero en Cuba hay seminarios.
So there is a seminary in Cuba. There is also opposition to that. It's hard to have, again, the resources to develop a student, to get them to the seminary and to help them to study. But there is a seminary. There are seminaries in
multiple.
Cuba. Yes.
En Cuba hay 3 seminarios, los más importantes evangélicos de Cuba.
There are 3 very important evangelical seminaries in Cuba.
Está el de Santiago de Cuba, que es de la Convención Bautista Oriental.
There's the one that's in Santiago de Cuba, where she was a professor, where that is in the eastern part of Cuba and is connected to the Eastern Baptist Convention of Cuba.
Está uno en el centro del país, que es de la Convención de los Pinos Nuevos.
And then there's a seminary that's in the middle of the island, and it is connected to Pinos Nuevos.
Y hay uno en La Habana, que es de la Convención Bautista Occidental.
And then there's one in Havana, and it's connected to the Western Baptist Convention of Cuba.
Ahora, hay otros pequeños seminarios en otras partes del país.
There's other small seminaries throughout the country as well.
Pero nuestro seminario de Cuba Oriental tiene, además de su sede principal, tiene 2 sedes más.
But our seminary on the eastern part of Cuba, the Eastern Baptist Seminary, they also have, they have their main campus in Santiago de Cuba, but they have 2 more campuses.
Oh, okay.
Y así como que yo me trasladé a la parte occidental ahora, pues estoy apoyando a la sede de La Habana.
And so one of those campuses is in Havana. So she recently, within the last 2 years, moved from the eastern part of Cuba to Havana. And so she's able to be an adjunct professor at the campus that is related to the seminary on the East Coast.
Pero por las necesidades económicas, de transporte, de movimiento, para alimentar a los estudiantes, hay otras alternativas que son respaldadas y promovidas por el seminario, donde los estudiantes pueden hacer sus primeros años en institutos locales.
But because of the lack of resources and being able to transport someone all the way across the island to the Eastern Baptist Seminary or the money that's needed for their transportation, their lodging, and their food to study at the seminary,
Right.
the Baptist Convention has created another layer of education, and that is through the Bible Institute. They can get their first years of like requirements for the seminary can be taken care of at the Bible Institute level.
Y eso es un recurso que tienen que vencer los estudiantes que quieren una graduación mayor, porque ya un tiempo sí tienen que pasarlo en la institución oficial.
So they go to the Bible Institute. They take care of their first couple of years of classes. But those who want to graduate with a seminary degree, they would then, after hitting those requirements, need to actually go to the seminary in order to officially finish with a diploma from the seminary.
Algunos no van a tener interés de llegar hasta el final, pero tenemos un liderazgo bien preparado en el camino.
So we know that all of the people who go and do their like prerequisites and stuff, they may not get to the point where they go to the seminary. But what we've decided to do with those first years of requirements is we are preparing good Christian leaders, solid Christian leaders for the church.
That's wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the resources, it's a common theme really in this conversation. And we'll talk a little bit more about the financial stability and stuff in Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
But even the resources that are needed to attend seminary, like we can't, as Americans, we cannot send money, can we?
We can get it in. Yeah. It's
in an interesting sort of way.
Yes, creative access, but yes.
Creative access.
Yo creo que el tema de los recursos ha salido muchas veces en la conversación. O sea, como que necesitan para poder ir a estudiar en el seminario. Me está preguntando ella, por ejemplo, ¿podemos llevar fondos o mandar fondos a Cuba? ¿Pueden entrar los fondos?
Bueno, nosotros necesitamos recursos.
Yes, we
Eso
need
es
resources. We can't deny
en el
that.
seminario, en los ministerios.
Whether it's in the seminary, the ministries.
Pero, por ejemplo, los recursos que llegan de Estados Unidos, ustedes tienen leyes para la entrega o disposición de recursos para Cuba.
But there's laws related to getting funds from the United States to Cuba.
Entonces hay muchos hermanos americanos dispuestos a apoyar el trabajo.
There are many American brothers and sisters in Christ who want to support the work in Cuba.
Y nosotros estamos contentos con eso y esperando que se abra la oportunidad, pero ustedes tienen que son los que tienen que saber, según sus leyes, cómo eso puede suceder.
And we are happy to know that we have people who are thinking of us and who want to be a part of what we're doing. But as Americans, we also have to think through, okay, what are the laws that are in place and how do we work within the confines that we have in order to get funding into Cuba?
Right.
Porque hay maneras, el gobierno americano ha establecido maneras que eso suceda, pero tiene que ser conforme a la ley que ustedes tienen acá.
The American government has established ways for us to work around some of the things to get funding into Cuba, but we have to be aware of what those laws are and work within those confines.
Right.
Muchos de los recursos que es más fácil hacer llegar más que el dinero son las cosas.
Something that many times is easier to get into Cuba outside of money are things, resources that can be taken
products.
in. Yeah.
Y no quiere decir que no se necesite el dinero.
Now, I don't want to say that money is not necessary.
Right.
Finances are necessary
It
for
is
all
necessary.
things. Yeah. Las cosas, por ejemplo.
Por ley, en Cuba ahora mismo, hace como 5 años, tenemos una ley que no tiene restricciones para alimentos y medicinas.
Because of the aseo.
Y aseo personal.
And so, ever since COVID, there's a law that is currently in place and looks like it's going to remain a permanent law for a time at least, where we can take in as much medicine, food, or personal hygiene items that we could possibly get
Wow.
onto an airplane and carry down with us.
Oh, okay.
Lo que la aerolínea le permita llevar a las personas, se lo dejan entrar a Cuba.
Whatever the airline chooses as far as the limit, that is allowed to go into Cuba without restrictions and without being
Wow.
taxed.
Okay.
Así hemos podido preparar, por ejemplo, la escuela de verano de este año.
So, for instance, that is how we're preparing our vacation Bible school for this year.
Con algo que ha entrado, hemos comenzado a equipar a algunas iglesias para que puedan hacer su escuela de verano, sus manualidades, porque no hay de nada. Y estamos felices con lo que está pasando de iglesias que también están dispuestas a apoyarnos para completar un número de iglesias que trabajarán la escuela de verano.
So, for instance, with some things that have come in, we're being able to equip or provide for some local churches so that they will have craft materials, so that they'll have snacks and such. Otherwise, they would not have those in their
For their
VBSs.
VBS.
And
Yeah.
so we have a Cuba VBS initiative right now that churches that are participating in order that we can hopefully hit the goal of giving craft materials and snacks and such to a certain number of churches who have been trained in
And
VBS.
the VBS. Yeah, it's I think we couldn't imagine VBS without snacks and crafts. I
Yeah.
mean, that's like a big part of VBS.
Nosotros, por ejemplo, no podemos imaginar la escuela bíblica de verano sin manualidades, sin la merienda.
So I think this is exciting that there are ways that we can contribute so that is a possibility.
Entonces me encanta saber que esta es una manera que nosotros podemos ayudar para así sentir parte de tu ministerio y lo que Dios está haciendo.
En el entrenamiento de escuelas de verano de este año, les enseñamos las posibles manualidades que tienen giros y vueltas.
In the Vacation Bible School training for this year, she did an online VBS training. They were able to show them possible crafts that they could do with the twists and turns VBS.
Which is what we just finished having.
Yeah, que acaban de terminar ellos.
Y tengo muchos mensajes en mi grupo donde las personas me dicen, ¿y cómo lo hacemos?
And so I have a lot of messages from the online training where people are saying, and how are we going to do those crafts? Like with what?
No podemos ir a una tienda a comprar papel
We can't go into a store and buy paper
porque no hay.
because there's no such thing. You can't do
Wow.
that in Cuba.
No podemos ir a comprar colores, pegamentos.
We can't buy markers or glue. There's not a store to go and purchase these items.
Entonces, tampoco las iglesias pueden planear su escuela de verano pensando que van a tener una merienda diaria para darle a los niños.
But our churches, for instance, they can't plan their VBS thinking that they're going to have snacks to give the children each day at VBS.
Sabiendo aún que a veces los niños vienen, si es en la mañana han salido sin desayunar, si es en la tarde han salido de sus casas sin almorzar.
And so, but they're very clear on the fact that if they're doing their vacation Bible school in the morning, the children are coming to VBS without having had breakfast. If they're coming to a VBS that starts in the afternoon, the teachers are clear that their students have not had breakfast or lunch when they come to VBS.
Y es difícil a veces mantener la atención de un niño que tiene hambre.
And it's difficult to keep a kid's attention when they have not been fed.
It's difficult when they have been fed.
Y es difícil aún cuando han comido algo.
A veces si podemos tener, aunque sea caramelos, ellos están tan felices como si fuera un pan.
I mean, when we have the ability to have some candy, they're happy as if we just gave them some bread.
Yeah.
Like they are excited to have something.
Pero estamos ayudando a las iglesias a pensar en trabajar al menos para una merienda en el día de la clausura.
But we are working really hard to help the churches think about having a snack, even if it's just one snack for the last day of VBS when they do their closing ceremony.
Yeah.
Ahora, hay iglesias que lo van a poder hacer. Hay un % de iglesias en Cuba que son iglesias grandes o que tienen partner con iglesias en los Estados Unidos.
And there's some churches that are going to be able to do this. There are churches in Cuba that are large churches, and they have either the resources or maybe they have a connection with ministries in the United States.
es un por ciento menor de iglesias.
It's a pretty small percentage of the churches.
Y me encanta trabajar con ellos porque es un poco más fácil
I
trabajar.
love working with those churches because it's a little easier to work with them.
Pero nuestro corazón está con las iglesias pequeñas, con las iglesias que no tienen recursos, con los pastores que nos dicen, ayúdanos.
But our hearts are truly with the smaller churches that don't have the
Yeah.
resources to do that, with the pastors who are coming to us and saying, please help us.
How
We
can
do
we-
not
yeah.
have a way of doing this.
I know you've raised money for some. Your goal is 200 churches,
That's
correct?
correct.
For the
Yeah.
and that's through the summer of 2023.
Yes.
Okay.
July and August.
July and August of 2023. How many churches have you already raised funds for at this point?
So at this very moment, we're calculating $50 per church
Mm-hmm.
to be able to get them the materials that they need and the snacks. And so this morning, as I was walking out of the house and checking everything, we were just over $3,000. We have three more churches who have taken on Cuba VBS as their offering for their Vacation Bible School.
That's exciting.
One of those churches started their VBS last night, and two other churches are coming down the pike, but that is going to be their main offering. But within that 3,000, just over 3,000, a good portion of that has also come in from individuals. And so mathematically speaking, however many, I think it's around
I know. I'm like, oh, the math.
60-something churches that we would say yes. But again, and maybe listeners are wondering,
Yeah.
well, so you give money, but you're saying there's no place to buy stuff in Cuba. So what are you doing?
How does that work?
So the Lord has been so gracious to Rhode and her siblings, and they have a Spanish passport through ancestry. So their grandfather's from Spain. And that Spanish passport has opened the world to them as individuals. And so her brother recently was able to take a trip to Panama. And in Panama, you can buy things.
Yeah.
So if we are able to get the actual funds to him, he can go into Panama and bring things from
He can bring
Panama
the things
to
back.
Cuba, which is actually a lot easier in many ways than us as Americans
Right.
taking those things down.
There could be there's more questions,
Yes.
possibly when Americans are bringing things down.
You would have to have a religious visa to enter back in with that type of material. But her brother is able, as a Cuban, to go out, get stuff from Panama, bring
come
it
back.
back.
Wow. Yeah, I'm glad that you answered that because I know people listening will be like, well, if there's a shortage.
Exactly.
But so that's good to know that there are ways that can happen.
We're having to be very creative.
Yeah.
She applied for her Spanish passport in 2008, as did her brother. And they just got their Spanish passports in 2022.
See, I think that is so foreign to thinking. I mean, 2022, so what is that? That's 14 years
Yeah.
that it takes to get the passport. But I think let's talk a little bit about like what everyday life is like in Cuba, because as you say, there are shortages of things. So what does that look like? I know you and I, Carmen, have talked a little bit about that as you've shared Rhode's ministry with me. Daily life, can be food shortages, electricity shortages. Just what is the kind of a snapshot of what that looks like?
Entonces hablamos un poco de la vida diaria en Cuba, que cómo es. Ella y yo hemos hablado de la escasez de cosas que hay en Cuba, sea comida, electricidad, las necesidades que ustedes tienen. ¿Cómo es la vida diaria en Cuba?
No hay palabras.
There's no words to even describe what daily life in Cuba is like.
Es difícil. Las familias tienen que vivir con una asignación de su canasta básica que pueden obtener de las instalaciones del Estado.
So
Es muy reducida.
it's very difficult. Many of you have probably heard of ration cards.
Right.
So the families have to live with this ration card, a monthly amount of food that is at your reach. It's not free. You're
Right.
just getting it at government cost.
La canasta básica, yo miro muestras de canastas básicas en otros lugares, no Estados Unidos, países de Latinoamérica. Y digo, ¿cuándo en Cuba eso va a ser una canasta básica?
And so there's a term that's used very frequently in Latin America. It's called canasta básica. It's the basic food basket for a family. And she's had the opportunity to travel outside of Cuba with me. And so when we go to Central America, when we're in Spain, the word canasta básica comes up a lot. This is your food basket for a month's worth of food for a family, is what that term basically means. So she looks at what a canasta básica in Nicaragua looks like, and she's going, how in the world would that ever be a reality in Cuba?
Right.
What's in
That
that
basket.
basket for a family for a month?
Porque la canasta básica en Cuba para un mes son 5 libras de arroz, 3 libras de arroz, porque quitaron 2.
So the canasta básica in Cuba for a month, it used to be 5 pounds of rice. It's gone now down to 3
20
pounds.
onzas de grano, cualquiera que
20
sea.
ounces of a grain, and it could be whatever grain. So think beans, lentils,
5 libras de azúcar,
5 pounds of sugar,
20 onzas de café,
20 ounces of coffee,
20 ounces of coffee.
5 huevos,
5 eggs
For a month.
por un mes,
medio litro de aceite
a half of a liter of oil,
y media libra de pollo por
and
persona.
half of a pound of chicken per person in the family
Por un mes.
for 1 month.
Wow.
Entonces, conseguir otros recursos para alimentar a la familia tiene que ver con economía.
So to be able to find other resources to add to that canasta básica for the month, you have to have funds to be able to purchase outside of what the government is offering.
Una familia que no tenga una manera de comprar alimentos a muy elevado precio no tiene cómo alimentarse después de una semana o 15 días del mes.
So after about a week, 15 days, and a month, if a family doesn't have outside resources or resources coming from somewhere, they have no way of continuing to feed their family that month.
Y eso es una realidad en Cuba.
And that's a reality for us in Cuba.
That. Sorry, that's hard to hear, you know,
Yeah.
because that's an entire country that is struggling under that weight.
Es bastante difícil escuchar porque es un país entero que está sufriendo bajo este peso.
Hay familias que tienen un poquito de otro desenvolvimiento porque si tienen un pasaporte y pueden salir, entran alimentos para su familia.
So there's other other families that have other possibilities, like if they were to have a passport, like her brother, if they have a way of getting out of the country, purchasing food, bringing it back to Cuba, then they have access to other food items.
Ahora, esto es una cara que no ven las personas cuando llegan a Cuba. Eso es lo que pasa dentro de las familias cubanas.
Now, this is only happening in the Cuban households, all of this shortage. You won't see this. If you come to Cuba, it's not something that's presented openly
Right.
to people who are visiting Cuba.
Porque si las personas llegan a Cuba y van a hoteles o van a lugares públicos, van a ver otra cosa y van a creer que esa es la manera en que viven las familias.
So
Y el pueblo cubano no vive así.
if we were to go down to Cuba right now and we decided that we would like to stay in a hotel, or we're in a touristy area where there may be a restaurant or something, you would be like, how does that match up with what Rhode is saying? Because where there is tourism, where there are people going into these hotels, you'll see a very different side of Cuba, which is not the reality of the Cuban home.
Everyday life. in
Everyday
Cuba.
life. Mhm.
Como hay tan pocos recursos nacionales, por ejemplo, hay una restricción muy grande en la electricidad que tienen los hogares.
So there's a lot of restrictions in the Cuban homes. Like, let's talk about electricity, for instance.
Y prácticamente están viviendo 10 horas al día sin electricidad.
Cuban families are living about 10 hours per day without electricity.
No hay combustible para los transportes, entonces no hay cómo moverse.
We don't have a way of getting around in Cuba because there is no gas or
Gasoline
diesel
shortage.
that we have access to.
O el precio para conseguir un transporte se va de cualquier presupuesto.
Or any type of transportation that you're able to find is absolutely unreachable with regards to a normal family budget.
No tenemos medicinas.
We don't have medicine.
Entonces, si usted se enferma y va al hospital, el médico le dice lo que lleva, pero le pide que lo consiga.
So if you get sick in Cuba, you go to the doctor. The doctor tells you what you have and the medicine that you need to figure out how to find.
That's your job to find the medicine,
Este es tu trabajo encontrar tu propia medicina. Yeah.
which is difficult because, I mean, you're just trying to find food too. I mean,
Yeah.
this is very difficult.
Es difícil porque a la vez estás buscando comida y ahora tienes que buscar medicina.
Es difícil.
So to give you an idea, like an average a family in Cuba, their household income is $13 a month. For a doctor, you're looking at $15 to $20 a month. Then to get a box of chicken, dark meat, 15 pieces of chicken, $60. So how
Wow.
do you bring that number together?
You can't
to
reconcile the two.
No, to talk to you about the Cuban peso, which is the currency that they earn in Cuba. A carton of eggs, there's 30 eggs in a carton there, is 2,000 Cuban pesos. And what a Cuban family would make income-wise for a month is 2,500 Cuban pesos.
Wow.
So how do you cover all of your
Yeah.
food needs, medical needs, pay for your electricity, if you've just spent 2,000 of your 2,500 on
Eggs. Wow. I think all of this just highlights even more the importance of reaching children in Cuba, because that truly is the only hope for their lives.
Esto para mí me muestra la importancia de alcanzar las generaciones, alcanzar la niñez de Cuba, porque ellos como que son la única esperanza del país. Sí.
Hay una frase de un héroe de Cuba, José Martí. Y José Martí tiene un escrito que dice: los niños son la esperanza del mundo. Y para nosotros, y para el sistema político de Cuba, es una manera de poder sembrar en los niños la transferencia de su propio mensaje. Pero es que esa es lo que tiene que hacer la iglesia. Sembrar en los niños cómo vamos a transferir el mensaje de generación a generación.
Yeah, there's a hero in Cuba, Jose Martí. He has a saying that the children are the hope. Que los niños son la esperanza.
Del mundo.
The children are the hope of the world. And truly, we have to think about that as a church, and that's something that we need to put in practice in the church, that we are able to correctly transfer the message of hope and through the gospel, through the church for the next generations.
Wow. Wow. This has been a very good conversation.
Esto ha sido muy buena conversación contigo, Rhode.
I'm so glad to finally meet you in person. I've
Qué
heard so
gusto
much.
por fin conocerte personalmente, cara a cara aquí. He escuchado mucho de ti.
Well, if somebody wanted to know more about Rhode's ministry, I know that there are ways to find out what's going on. I have this card in front of me with her name and picture.
Si alguien quiere saber un poco más de tu ministerio, pues yo sé que hay formas en que se pueden juntar a ministerio, saber. Yo tengo la foto tuyo aquí con la información.
But I can put some of this information in our show notes if people would like to just kind of check out her ministry.
Yeah.
As she works with you, and if that would be okay.
Yes, and another thing I've been encouraging people to do, I have a closed Facebook group, and if you're not on that Facebook group, it's going to be Carmen-Live Global. I have to invite you to the group. So you can ask me, send me a message on Messenger or whatever, and ask me if you can be a part of the group. I'll allow you to come in. It's a closed group because I am working in closed countries. But I do a lot of updating from Rhode's ministry on like a daily, weekly basis.
It's a great group to be a part of because you get a really good picture of what's happening and ways to be involved.
And that'll keep you up to date with how do I pray for Rhode today? What's going on? Right now, she has a team of 16 people, and it's called Reaching Generations. As she's here in the States, taking time to go and meet with partners and everything, her team is still on the ground working.
Right.
So we're still getting reports from Cuba constantly. And when she passes that information to me, I try to put it on my Facebook so that you can get to know her team members. You can hear about all of the different ministries that are involved in because we have only touched like 2, maybe 3 here today. And it's an extensive ministry with an amazing group of people. And I'm trying my hardest to get their names out there as well so that you know how to pray for the different areas of ministry that are related to reaching generations. So I'd love for you to...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'll put that also in the resources, how they can reach out to you. But, I mean, and, you said this is just a small part of her ministry, but this is as huge as all of this with Rhode is. It's just a small part of your ministry.
Yeah.
So it's been exciting to just sit and talk about what the Lord is doing and to find out ways to better pray. And just to know what is going on in Cuba.
Yes.
So I really appreciate you all sitting down with me today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having us. Muchas gracias por tenernos aquí.
Muchas gracias. Para mí ha sido un placer poder compartir lo que el Señor está haciendo.
Thank you so much for allowing us to be here. It's truly been a blessing to be able to share all that God is doing in Cuba.
Well, maybe we'll get to do it again in the future and get more updates.
Yeah, ojalá que podamos hacerlo de nuevo y tener más actualizaciones de tu ministerio.
That'd be great. Well, thanks for joining us today. Like I said, check out the show notes, and there will be more information on how you can reach out to Carmen and find out about Rhode's ministry.
Thank you for listening to Impact the World. Follow us on Instagram or Facebook. Just look for the profile West Park Baptist.